The reopened FBI background investigation of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh is now underway. It's also under a deadline and under fire as questions remain about the scope of the investigation and who sets the boundaries of what the FBI can and cannot look into. Also, what's the likely political impact on the push to confirm Trump's pick as an Associate Justice and the implications for the upcoming midterms? Let's talk about that. We begin with former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Elliot Williams. He's in our nation's capital. He served for 8 years in the Obama administration at the Department of Justice and as Assistant Director for Legislative Affairs at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He's also a former staffer to Senator Chuck Schumer. We welcome him back. All right, Elliot, what do you make of this reopening and time limit on it?
Well, the interesting thing, Larry, from your introduction was that you said a quick and comprehensive FBI investigation. Unfortunately, to some extent, those two impulses are in conflict. You could do it quickly, but what happens if the FBI begins to uncover information or uncover evidence or uncover more leads that would require a deeper, fuller investigation? That's what's potentially so troubling and problematic, or at least complicated, about setting that 1 week timeline, because you just don't know how long it might take to dig up some of these leads on a case that does stretch back some 36 years.
President Trump said it's up to the Senate.
He did say it's up to the Senate. Now, remember, it is the President of the United States that orders the investigation. So that's why, if you notice at the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing last week, there was some confusion as to when and how the investigation would take place and who, when it would be conducted and so on. It's ultimately the President's call. Now, the Senate has requested the general parameters of it, but the President recently stated that now almost like the lid is lifted off and the FBI can look into whoever they want as long as they do it within a week. You hit it right on the head with your introduction again, Larry, where you said it's just a little bit confusing as to what exactly the scope and the parameters are. And in fact, the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which, as you said, where I used to work, has already asked for a written disclosure of what exactly is the scope of this investigation, because we are all confused, even those of us who follow these issues very, very closely.
How would you characterize how the Judiciary Committee has handled this to this minute? When we talk about process, I think we're sort of failing, and we should really be getting at, well, what's at issue here? It is a seat on the Supreme Court, and to some extent underlying that is this question of how the Senate Judiciary Committee and how America treats sexual assault victims, or at least at a minimum, sexual assault accusers. This is uncharted territory for the Senate. Now, obviously, you had the Anita Hill matter back in 1991, but allegations of this kind and how they deal with it is always going to be incredibly complicated. So we can always look backward as to, should Senator Feinstein have done things differently and raised the allegations sooner? Should the Senate Republicans have been more aggressive about pursuing the charges? I don't think that's a productive exercise right now. What's more productive is, okay, we have a credible allegation of sexual assault from an individual who was under oath, who presented it. That is in conflict at a minimum with Judge Kavanaugh's testimony. So now what do we do? And the question is, what are we seeking to do? Is it to convict Judge Kavanaugh, or is it to make the assessment as to whether he ought to be on the Supreme Court? Now, a factual dispute like that certainly should raise questions about his fitness for the Supreme Court, even if you couldn't convict him on the charges. So, it's a dangerous game to start getting into straight up assessments of how they handled the process. And I think we should all just move forward and figure out what comes next. In his opening statement last week, Kavanaugh declared the confirmation process a national disgrace. Others, not Kavanaugh's opponents, claim the system is broken. What's your take?
Again, I think the greater cancer that needs to be excised from the process and the system is how we treat women and how we treat sexual assault victims. Ultimately, what we saw at that hearing on last Thursday was a woman who
in true to form, had to be polite and deferential and almost demure, for lack of a better term, and a man who got away with pounding the table and yelling and crying and so on, and to some extent might be rewarded for that. People, I think the National Review had an article that said that people only hear you when you're angry. Well, people only hear men when they're angry. So I think the better question and the bigger question is, how do we handle these allegations of assault? Now, there's no question that our politics are polarized and partisan, and to some extent, the United States Senate is beginning to look more and more like the House of Representatives, where it's majority rule and so on. And perhaps that's something that needs to be addressed longer term. But again, I think the bigger problem that got exposed this past week was all about gender and all about sexual assault and sexual harassment.
We're so divided. If the Democrats get control of Congress, do you think they would move to impeach Kavanaugh if he's confirmed?
There have already been talks about it. There's already been suggestion about it. So certainly, and there's already talk about impeaching the president. You've seen that the House of Representatives, there are people and a number of candidates today who are presenting that that's a road they want to go down. Certainly there's been talk about it. Now again, there are a number of, even prior to the sexual assault allegations, there were a number of circumstances in which people, members of Congress had identified at a minimum inconsistencies and at a maximum untruths in Judge Kavanaugh's testimony. If you notice, there was questions of nominations he'd worked on. There's questions of his knowledge of stolen emails from the 1990s, from the early 2000s in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And now there's question and talk about, was he truthful even about the partying in high school and what the term boofing or devil's triangle means, and so on. So there's certainly talk about inconsistencies and perhaps untruths or prevarications in his testimony. And I think you might see renewed or continued questions and calls for reviving that come the next Congress.
Elliot Williams, thank you so much. Thank you for your time today.
It's always a pleasure, Larry. Thanks again.